as organized by Symbiosis Center for Emotional Wellbeing. And I would like to introduce our esteemed speakers. We have Sayantan Datta and Amanjeet Kaur Ahuja with us. Thank you so much for joining us and taking out the time from your busy schedule to join us. It really means quite a lot. So just to walk everyone through what we are doing today, the theme of our webinar is making campuses a safe and inclusive place for all. And I think, Rashi, we can not see it in slideshow. I think you'll have to share your entire screen. Yeah, thank you. So the theme of the webinar is making campuses a safe and inclusive place for all. And we are here to talk and get insights from Amanjeet and Sayantan on how to make our campus a more safe and inclusive place. What does that mean? What does that look like? What are the challenges? And how can we build a stronger, resilient, and more inclusive community together? For Sayantan and Amanjeet, just a little bit about them for our audience. Very happy to introduce Mr. Sayantan Datta. They are an assistant professor at Kriya University, an award-winning journalist and a children's book writer. Their work focuses mainly on the intersections of gender, sexuality, caste, science, and health. A warm welcome, Sayantan, to you. And we have Amanjeet Kaur Ahuja with us. Thank you so much for taking out the time. She's the Director of Student Services at Kriya University and has established and oversees the Office of Inclusive Learning Support. Her work of area is diversity, inclusion, sociology of gender, and social stratification specifically. Thank you again, Amanjeet, for joining us for this webinar.
Thank you so much for having us.
Right. Okay. All right. So I guess with further ado, we'll start if everyone is okay with it. So I'll put open questions, and if either of you are comfortable answering, please feel free to do so. We'll start, I think, with just a broad understanding for our audience. If you can tell us a little bit about, in simple language, what does the term LGBTQIA entail? What does it mean for our audience? And if you can also reflect and help us see what does the term inclusive language mean, because we hear that quite a lot, to use inclusive language, and what would that entail, especially from a university perspective?
All right, I'm happy to start this off, but Amanjeet, please feel free to chip in if you think I'm missing anything or getting anything wrong. The term LGBTQIA plus is an acronym. What that means is that instead of being one umbrella term that captures different I mean that homogenizes a group of marginalized people, it actually is a collective of terms, different terms that represent different genders, gender expressions, sexual orientations, and sex characteristics. So by gender, what we mean is a person's internal and social experience of how they perceive themselves in terms of gender. In terms of gender expression, we think of it as an exterior way by which a person carries themselves. So, for example, I might want to express my gender by wearing a certain kind of clothing or putting on certain kind of jewelry or by putting on certain kind of makeup or not doing any of those. And those external markers that we use to express ourselves are called gender expression. Then we talk about sexual orientation, which is the kind of the people who we are romantically and erotically sexually attracted to. That would count as sexual orientation. Of course, the common terms are heterosexual and homosexual, and then there's bisexual, pansexual, but these are really not all encompassing, and there are several terms that capture a very, very diverse sexual orientation that is as diverse as humanity itself. And then we have sex characteristics. Sex characteristics are biological markers. There are several biological markers, characteristics like endocrinological markers like hormones, chromosomal markers like chromosomes, and genital markers, secondary sex characteristics that one uses that a person possesses. And the very interesting thing about all of this is that none of these necessarily need to be in coherent with each other. So what I mean by that is that just because somebody has a XY conformation of chromosomes doesn't mean that they would have the same production of testosterone and same kind of receptors that sense that testosterone. They will not develop the same kind of secondary sex characteristics. They may or may not develop male genitalia. They might not identify as a man. They may or may not choose to express their gender the way that they are expected to in terms of social conventions. So what I'm trying to say is that these are different aspects of our lives, and these aspects do not necessarily sync with each other. In certain cases they do, in some other cases they don't. That is how diversity looks like. In terms of inclusive language, I think the larger goal of speaking about inclusive language is to recognize that the kind of many a times that the kind of terminologies that circulate in society, including in educational institutions that are very much a part of society, um, many of them carry histories of oppression. They carry stigma, they carry prejudice, and there are alternative terms that members of marginalized groups themselves, including LGBTQIA plus people, themselves have recognized as more affirmative of their identities and experiences. And using those terms is generally seen as a more inclusive act. I did not expand the LGBTQIA plus acronym. I should do that at this point. So L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer, I for intersex, A for asexual. And the plus reflects and recognizes that this acronym is not all inclusive. It is a placeholder for a very diverse diverse communities and groups of people, and the plus leaves that space open for us to recognize that more alphabets might get added as we learn and recognize more diverse identities. Amanjeet, if you have something to add.
Thank you, Shantan. I think just want to add to the conversation on inclusive language, especially because we're talking in the context of higher education and universities. As Shantan, they mentioned that these terminologies that we use really represent histories of oppression, power structures, and also built on certain assumptions. So, for example, the terms that we use in our university: chairman of the board, ombudsman. So assuming that only a cis man could occupy these positions. So simple acts, just like making sure that these are replaced with, chairman becomes a chairperson, ombudsman becomes an ombudsperson, are very small, but yet very powerful ways in which sort of you can work towards inclusive language. And I think that's something that we've constantly been conscious of, even, the way policies are written. I remember initially it always used to be the student is always a he, as it would be mentioned in a policy document. Then eventually it became he, she. But I think that also is not inclusive. So we need to sort of go beyond these sort of binaries and gendered language and find a way to make our expression more inclusive. And which means essentially challenging these systems of oppression and power structures, and also being conscious of it. And this is not really it's not really a humongous ask. It's not a big deal to replace chairman with chairperson, ombudsman with ombudsperson, making sure your policy documents, the way your administrative documents are written, are inclusive. These are very small but powerful acts. And I think any higher education administrators who are here, faculty who are here, I would say that this is the first thing that you can start with. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think thank you so much, Shantan and Amanjeet, for those pointers. Shantan for the brilliant, detailed explanation for our audience, and Amanjeet for the small steps I think you told us that we can make in a university setup. I also remember in one of our previous conversations where you suggested that even in our Google Forms, a small change where we mentioned gender, sex, and what does that look like. And I think these small steps can have such a powerful impact, and we just need to consciously do more of that. And in similar language, since you're talking so much about inclusive language, I think it would also be helpful if we sort of break the term DE&I and what does that entail, and why is it crucial in a university setup specifically.
I think Amanjit should begin answering this question. This is very much the domain of her office, but I'm happy to chip in as and when required. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think just to put, of course, DNI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, different institutions have framed this question differently based on their larger vision, mission, and again, like these are very political, concepts, and there is no, I don't think there's one uniform understanding of these concepts. So I would really sort of talk about it from the way I have understood it and sort of how we have worked towards DNI, DI in our institution, but it could be completely different. But I would say still there would be some larger governing principles that would sort of remain. Is of course first thing is diversity, right? You understand that dealing with a homogeneous community, people have different identities, and all of us have so many identities that we work with on a daily basis, right? And to also understand that all these identities overlap to make sure that our experience ultimately is unique. So, for instance, I may be a cis woman, but I am from a minority religious community. I may be from a certain class position. So I may experience, discrimination or subjugation on certain aspects of my identity, but at the same time, some aspects, maybe say my class position or my educational background would give me access to certain powers it would give me access to certain access of powers, right? So to understand this, I think one is that not everyone is the same. Their experiences are unique. Communities are extremely heterogeneous, and the fact that there are differences, right? What has essentially happened is that these differences get hierarchized. So a certain difference would be ranked higher on a day-to-day basis. But actually, if you see, these are just plain simple differences. So diversity in very simple context, and as we sort of talk about it, is just to respect differences, to acknowledge that there are differences, and you respect and not constantly try to sort of work towards hierarchizing them. And I remember, I mean, when I was in college, there was this example that you go to a vegetable market, there are thousands of vegetables, but you don't really rank the vegetables, right? Like so like spinach has more power than this and that. So it's just like just different vegetables. So similarly, that's how we sort of understand. Second is, given this context of diversity and intersectionality, and I talked about how different experiences are unique, and so even say two students with the same disability may not have the same experience. First of all, the disability itself could manifest itself differently. For example, two students with visual impairment may have a completely different experience of their education trajectory, depending on what is the nature of the disability. Is it like 80% visual impairment, 100%? Is it a certain kind of another visual complication? Or it could also be different experience based on the class position that they come from, or the kind of caste background they might come from, or so many different things together sort of uh, you know uh, influence the kind of experience that we may have, the oppression we may face, or the power positions that we occupy on a day-to-day basis. And that's why I think equity sort of is not the same as equality, right? Equality is like everyone's equal. No, everyone's not equal. And equity has a sort of a shade of justice to it, which means that uh, two students with the same who might be studying in the same class, but might need completely different kind of support systems or interventions based on the kind of background, the kind of experiences that they have. So, which is why, like, for example, in the office that we have, inclusive learning support, there's a concept of reasonable accommodation. So, the accommodations that we give to students, for example, extra time, is not really to make sure that, okay, you give a benefit of one, to one student over the other. It's really to sort of make sure that because the starting field, I mean, this is something that's very commonly said, the starting point in the race is not the same for everyone. You just sort of make sure that you give some support or access to certain resources to ensure that those years of marginalization, oppression, of course, cannot be done away with, you know, the support and accommodations you will give, but at least one can sort of try and facilitate. So equity is that notion that not everyone has the same experience, not every student in the class is same, not all learners in the classroom are the same, right? And especially because we're talking about uh, LGBTQI plus community here, and I think to sort of understand that their experiences are diverse, so diverse, and you cannot assume the same solution will. It's not a one size fit all policy, right? So that's keeping that in mind, and of course, inclusion is that it's always a goal. I don't think any institution can claim that we are very inclusive. I think there's always you can always say that, okay, we're in a process of making ourselves inclusive. We are facilitating this process, and that's the goal, but we are nowhere near it, because that I don't know if 100% inclusion is ever possible because of the range of experiences. And even like, I see people saying that they're inclusion experts, D&I experts, and I can say that I don't think anybody can ever have an expertise in this area, given the vast nature of experiences, how complex everything is. So we can always be an advocate, and that's how we sort of frame it in our context. We say we are D&I advocates. We don't say that we are experts, because we don't claim to know everything about everything. And I may have worked with students from different backgrounds, but even the next student that may come to me may present a completely different context, experience, challenge that I may not know. So working in D&I is also about understanding that you don't know everything. You will keep learning, unlearning every day. I think unlearning is the most critical aspect here. And I think that's something that and of course, things keep changing with time, right? Like what we thought was acceptable and inclusive even 3 years ago has been sort of challenged today. So that dynamism has to be kept alive. And happy to see what Shanthan has to add to this.
Thanks. I think I just want to emphasize that when we use DEI as the term for our conversation, we also need to keep in mind that that recognizing diversity, providing equity, or working towards equity, and making spaces more inclusive cannot happen without structural changes in those spaces that we're talking about. So if you're talking about educational institutions, simply thinking about how do you increase the representation of students and faculty from different marginalized groups, but particularly queer, trans, and intersex communities. The representation question is very important, but that is not the only only way ahead. There's a larger structural change required in terms of how we think about campus infrastructure, how we think about campus policies, how we think about the relationship between the administration, the faculty body, and the student body. And I think I'm happy to talk more about that later, but I think recognizing that for diversity, equity, and inclusion to happen, we need structural changes, and sometimes these structural changes are quite university-wide, require consultation of several different stakeholders, and in some sense challenges our vision of how we are trained to think about universities. I think recognizing that is very important. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it makes a lot of sense, the points that both of you have put forward. I'm wondering if we are talking about structural changes at university level, and how that can be implemented, and if there are smaller steps that we as individuals, as staff, faculty of the university can take to constantly keep in mind to make a space more inclusive, to keep the DEI idea alive at all times for us in like smaller levels. And if either of you had any ideas of how we can do that, of course, inclusive language becomes one, as I understand. And one point that Amanjeet put forward was making accommodations from an equity stance for different students and what that would look like. So I'm just wondering if there are further pointers or initiatives that you would suggest that we can take at an individual level also as part of the university.
Right. I can start this off because I wrote an entire policy brief a couple of years back addressing this very question. And I think if you're talking about structural changes, it might be helpful to look at structural changes at a couple of levels, couple of scales. And let me start with the one that's been one of the more visible ones, which is the question of infrastructure. If you've come across news reports around gender neutral accommodation, gender neutral hostels, gender neutral washrooms, then these are the changes that we are kind of talking about when we say infrastructural changes. So the idea behind infrastructural changes stems from the recognition that the very material space of educational institutions, the concrete and the greenery that we talk about, the literally the benches and the staircases and the elevators and the hostels and the classrooms, um, they are all marked by a certain kind of cis heteronormativity. So what I mean by that is, for example, most campuses in the country, if not all, uh, have hostels that are segregated, and they are segregated typically in a male female or a man woman binary. uh, and if you look at washrooms, the case would be similar. I know of some campuses where elevators to access different floors of the building are segregated by genders, staircases are segregated by sexes or genders. um, there are classrooms where people wear uniforms and sit in rows, and I'm talking about university or college classrooms. There is a row of students where only boys sit, and then there's a row of chairs where girls sit within the classroom. So this kind of segregation, addressing this segregation, is one way in which we change the infrastructure of the institution. So how do we build washrooms or hostels that allow people of different genders to feel comfortable staying in or using those spaces? So, for example, if one has ever been to conferences in the European Union. I've never been there, but what I've heard is that oftentimes it's a common practice to have washrooms that declare the kind of urinal or commode that is there, instead of segregating these washrooms in terms of this is for use by somebody who's assigned male at birth, and this is for use by somebody who's assigned female at birth. The washroom declares what is inside the washroom, so that people can who prefer a certain kind of utility over another of all genders can use that washroom. In terms of infrastructure, similarly, there's a quite hostel infrastructure. There's quite some discussion happening around how hostels are segregated around the male-female binary. But one must expand the infrastructure to also think, and this probably is also more relevant to the kind of work that SCEW is doing, which is to think about the medical infrastructure on campus, the health infrastructure on campus, the administrative infrastructure on campus as a part of the campus infrastructure. So is the medical practitioner on campus sensitized towards particular issues faced by queer, trans, and intersex people? Is the mental health care professional who's present on campus, or who the campus is liaisoning with, Are they aware, sensitized about uh, gender, sexuality, gender characteristics, gender expression, sex characteristics, etc.? Um, so one level is thinking about infrastructural levels. Then comes the question of policy, and Amanjit can talk more about it. But very briefly, based on my research, uh, one thing that we recognized is that campus policies are um, largely, again, they work within the male-female binary, but even the affirmative action policies, policies that that seem to address grievances, they do not really explicitly recognize gender, sexual orientation, and sex characteristics as axes through which people can be discriminated. Um, so what I mean by that is that if you look at campus policies around sexual harassment, right, and most campuses I know of declare themselves as a zero tolerance campus in terms of sexual harassment, but the policies do not explicitly recognize the kind of sexual harassment that can be faced by queer, trans, and intersex people on campuses. Something that is very important to recognize because it happens very rampantly and happens very differently and covertly than how one would think a cisgender heterosexual woman is getting sexually harassed. But more importantly, these policies rarely recognize instances where let's say somebody who's queer themselves becomes sexually violent towards somebody else. There is no space in most of these policies that we looked at to look at these complex intersections. Um, Again, this idea extends to all policies on campuses. So student life policies, anti-ragging policies. So how does one recognize specific kinds of very violent ragging that happen in educational institutions, which have actually led to deaths of uh, queer, trans, and intersex people on campuses? How does one recognize the homophobia and the transphobia that is implicit or even explicit in these acts of sexual harassment and violence? And policies need to recognize this and address them appropriately. Um, then there is the idea of curriculum. That is another scale that I want to focus on briefly, and then I can talk a little bit about the campus as a general space. But in terms of curriculum and one of the things that came out in so I probably have done the first of its kind study in looking at transgender non-conforming and gender non-binary people's experiences in Indian science institutions. But I do believe that the findings apply to educational institutions in general. But what we found is that in that the curriculum that is taught, and that is taught particularly in some disciplines, is not has not caught up with the kind of discourse that we have around gender and sexuality in contemporary times. I think there's a Madras High Court judgment 2021, I believe, that forced the National Medical Commission to take a stock of homophobia and transphobia in its syllabus and revise medical textbooks to bring them up to speed. And I think this did not happen for something like psychology, because psychology does not fall, despite being a clinical discipline, it at least at least partly a clinical discipline, it does not fall within the National Medical Commission's purview. And a student and I looked at a couple of psychology textbooks where we were trying to see how psychology textbooks frame um, gender, sexuality, queer, trans, intersex people, and we found quite some outdated stuff in many of these very popular textbooks. Um, so in terms of the curriculum and in terms of classroom practices, we need to be very mindful and careful in terms of recognizing that our disciplines themselves have been perpetuating harm, and that we might be teaching harmful content in our classroom without realizing it. Being mindful of it helps us realize that and then work towards addressing those problems, devising curricula, bringing in diverse voices, experts who can help us understand that better. And finally, just to leave, and sorry for this very long answer. I got carried away. It's an area of research, and I'm deeply motivated by it. But if one actually thinks about and steps beyond these sort of these granular scales that I've been talking about, or levels of interventions that I've been talking about, one needs to think about the campus as a space that needs to enable queer, trans, and intersex people. Affirmative action, like Amanjeet pointed out, in terms of reservations, in terms of additional support, in terms of relaxed metrics. I mean, those are some interventions that one can make, but also thinking about empowering queer, trans, and intersex people to build their own communities and take the lead in dictating what kind of sensitization events they want to happen on campus, what kind of conversations and in what format should they be happening. These are very important discussions that that campuses need to facilitate. I would like to think of the administrative body on campus as a body that is willing to get sensitized about these matters and is willing to facilitate queer, trans, and intersex students and faculty and administrative staff, if there are any, to come together and take a lead in dictating sensitization events, policy changes, infrastructural changes, etc. on campuses. On that note, I'm happy to shut up for a while. I'm really sorry for that long response. Yeah.
Thank you so much again, Shantan. I think that was such a brilliantly detailed answer. So what I'm hearing from you is how we need like a multi-layered intervention for this. And this conversation in itself, of course, is very layered. How we need infrastructural changes to policy changes to curriculum changes. And then, of course, the small interventions that we can do at a campus level also to make it a safe and inclusive space for all. Amanjeet, if you would like to add anything.
I think just to add to what Shantan has said, I think one very important principle that any institution working on any kind of inclusion, first of all, the question is, who are we including? What are we including them to? Those need to be answered. But say, for example, we are working to sort of work towards the concerns of queer, trans, intersex students on our campus. And I think everyone should follow this principle, which of course the disability movement has given us, is nothing for us without us, right? And I'll give you a very concrete example from our own experience at our university, where we were trying to build gender neutral washrooms. So of course, in principle, it was approved, and the administration office, they just decided to go ahead, change the signages, and they were like, in their best intention, they were doing this. But of course, the way it was carried out was not at all acceptable to many people from the community, right? And the fact that none of them were consulted, including our staff, trans faculty and staff members who identify as trans, queer, intersex, or students. So the fact that this was done, in principle, yes, you've approved all gender washroom or gender neutral washrooms. But what's the point? Like, ultimately, it actually ended up doing a lot more damage than, So after that, the same process happened, but this time, again, it was done with a lot of consensus building, making sure that the relevant stakeholders were consulted, their inputs were taken. And the administration, we sort of understood that our role here is only to facilitate and implement and sort of take the inputs and, make sure that we are really translating and implementing things that we are being told. And I think hearing and listening to what they're saying, their concerns, is very important. So I think that's something that one has to take into account. And that's a principle that we always follow. Every time we are implementing a new policy which concerns any group of students, we have to make sure that we take their inputs or the concerned staff, faculty members into account. The other is, I think institutions really need to think about this, especially in case of protecting the interests of queer, trans, intersex, other marginalized groups, is confidentiality and right to privacy, because many students come who identify as queer, trans are not out to their family, to their faculty, staff. So it has happened, one, that the university needs to, I think, make it very clear what is their principle of communication with parents, because I've noticed this in so many cases, despite, running an office that has inclusive learning support, they're always so suspicious that whether this information will go out to their parents or not. So I think that principle of, information, who is collecting the information, what will we do with this information, who can it be shared, can it be shared without their consent or not, is very, very important. And for actually, like Shantan mentioned, right, representation is one thing, but how will you actually make sure that you move beyond representation and actually making sure that these students feel included in the community? So that is very important, like making these principles transparent. And even within your offices, like for example, in our office there are different team members, and we give the students an option to choose whoever they are comfortable with sharing, because they might not be comfortable sharing with somebody or even me, but like they might feel comfortable with another student, with another staff member, right? So, and then we make sure that those principles of confidentiality and privacy are protected within the team, within the staff members, across departments as well. And this is very, 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 I cannot emphasize how important this is, because when a student, no student will approach you if they do not know how the information they are giving to you, which is something that they may be very vulnerable for, how it is treated, who you can inform, and make your protocols very clear to them that only in these situations ABCD will we share this information without your consent, so that the student can make the informed choice. So I think these policies are very important, the two principles that I mentioned. And of course, Shantan already covered the, like the need for the IC policy in the university to be reviewed. And one thing is, like, making sure, for example, most of us universities, we have orientation programs, using that time to also bring up some of these conversations. Like we do have mandatory workshops which all students, irrespective of whichever program they get into at KRIA, have to undergo. And these, of course, include a mandatory POSH workshop, a mandatory workshop on DNI and understanding intersectionality, a mandatory workshop on disability, because this is also, you're signaling to them that this is very important to us as an institution. So I think these are the three things that I would sort of add, because I think when a student comes and they feel seen, they feel heard, they feel, okay, this institution is actually valuing these principles, it'll actually enable them to come forward and feel comfortable to approach different departments.
Absolutely. I think all points mentioned are so relevant to the context that we're talking about, and also doable to a large extent if we just put in the resources in that direction. So we at SCEW, we actually hold induction programs where we do talk about homesickness, adjustment, and then gender sensitization as a part of it, and maybe including more aspects of, also POSH, also disability, can really strengthen the idea even more since the very beginning as a student enters the space, and for hopefully to build a safe space then. All right. Also, at the same time, since we are talking about so many changes, it clearly also indicates that there are so many challenges the community faces as they enter any new environment. And since we are specifically talking about higher educational settings, can either of you quickly also walk us through what are some of the challenges that a student or a staff member from the community may experience? And I'm also wondering if we can also talk about the challenges that a educational institute faces in implementing the things that we are talking about, since there is so much diversity at play here. So it's a twofold question.
I'll try to take the first part, and Amanjit can take the second one, and then happy to exchange notes as possible. It is quite daunting to try and capture all challenges, partly because there are too many, and partly because we've been saying that this is a conglomeration of communities that are so diverse that their challenges are bound to be substantially different. And even at an individual level sometimes. So I'll just try to give a very broad brush picture of things, rather than try to delve into very specific details. I think so. The idea is that if educational spaces are indeed a part of society, and educational spaces largely reflect and reproduce the kind of social biases, stigma, prejudice that one sees, then a queer, trans, or intersex person is walking into a space um, that has invisibilized them, at times criminalized them, and is simply not built keeping their experiences in mind. So what that leads to inevitably is a sense of othering and alienation. So right, so if you constantly feel like you're different from everybody else here, and that this space is not for you. Um, uh, and that othering and alienation leads to a host of different things, but then there are explicit acts of stigma and prejudice that queer and transgender and intersex people might face. So for example, when I was doing my field work to understand the lived experiences of queer, trans, intersex people in science institutions, one of my respondents mentioned that when they went to the principal of their college to ask for a for a cell, or yeah, for basically formal recognition of an informal collective of queer, trans, intersex students, the principal said something on the lines of, "I did not know that we have quote unquote such students here, and do they come to the campus to study?" As if queer, trans, intersex people are incapable of pursuing higher education and doing well in higher education. So, so there is stigma, prejudice that actively works against queer, trans, intersex people. They can take explicit forms, they can take implicit forms, but there's a general sense of othering and alienation that one feels as a queer, trans, intersex person. So your immediate friends don't always understand you. Your faculty don't always understand you. The administration doesn't understand you often. At times, like let's say if I'm somebody who's taking hormones as a trans woman and undergoing medical transition, or have started the process of medical and social transitioning, um, people are going to look at you very differently. You will need a kind of accommodation that has to account for the kind of uh, yeah, the kind of setting into the hormone regime that is required. Yeah, basically what I'm saying is that these experiences have been invisibilized within educational spaces for a very long time. So educational spaces are not built keeping these experiences in mind. So when you come into it, there's this void, and you're constantly trying to negotiate uh, a space that is not meant for you. And I'm trying to think of a metaphor, but I don't. Nothing comes to me right now. But it is exactly that, being in a space that is simply not meant for you to be in, that didn't imagine you being there ever. And yeah, I think that is a big challenge. I'll stop now, eager to hear what Amanjeet has to say about the second part of the question.
Thanks, Shantanu. I think from an institutional point of view, the challenges are, of course, many. One is, of course, getting everyone on the same page, right? Institutions are huge entities with different departments and different stakeholders. Each stakeholders have their own needs. And of course, they are looking at their own respective needs in a very isolated fashion, right? So how do you sort of get everyone together on the same page? Which would of course start by first acknowledging that this is something that we need to focus on, right? This is something that we really need to work on. It's difficult to get people to make sure their calendars match, even organize one session together with staff, faculty. So it's really really hard to sort of build consensus, and which only becomes easier if really the top management, people who are in the governing council, board of management, the vice chancellor, the deans, if they are not really invested in this, and if it's not coming from top down, then it's really hard, sort of make sure that one can keep working towards unless of course there's a very strong student advocacy on campus that's happening and a movement, and which is what usually happens in most cases. It's really the students who sort of take on this challenge and try to negotiate constantly with the administration. So I think one is, first of all, to make the institution understand that this is important, why this is important, and also getting everyone on the first, like on the same page. How exactly, okay, fine, like we understand that we want to uh, work towards accommodating the needs of students who may identify as queer, intersex, trans, but how is it that we would do that, right? Because like I said, most of the times people at the top have their own notions of what would work, and that's what they will go by. So really this the consensus building process, which is extremely painstaking and needs a lot more time, is very, very difficult. The other is, of course, sustained change like this takes time, and for that you need people who are dedicated, resources who are dedicated, money, which is of course something that uh, doesn't happen very easily. Most of us end up taking, if we are invested in inclusion, we want to work towards it. We probably have another role or another full-time role that we may be doing alongside, right? So getting institutions to even dedicate resources who would work on this exclusively, because otherwise we will just be like talking about it, right? So how does the translation from conversation theory actually translate into implementable policies? Is someone dedicatedly working on them, which is again difficult from an institution point of view. The third again is linked to different, institutions are huge entities. There are different departments, different bodies, and they have their own needs. Because say a center for emotional well-being may understand the requirement of something like this, but an admissions team may not. So and that's really the first point, right? When a student comes, logs onto your website, browses the application form, the way you, like I've mentioned earlier, the way you collect data on gender, how do you collect their information, what is the terminology that you've used, that in itself is such a it's a very important step, right? But maybe the admissions officer or the outreach team members may not understand the importance of doing something like this, unless, of course, there is a lot of pressure from top down. What I think has worked with us is that thankfully UGC has been coming up with very important, they've released important guidelines. They released one in 2022, comprehensive inclusivity guidelines, which did talk about, at least, I mean, it has talked about the requirements and needs of trans students. So we have usually, used them to sort of push for certain changes. Then, of course, UGC requires institutions to nominate gender champions. So I think there's a constant bargaining that one has to do. And administration, I keep saying, is not a homogeneous body, right? It's not like the entire administration has one view. There are so many conflicting views within, and therefore students, if there are any students listening to this, please make sure you find the weakest link, understand where you can bargain, negotiate, find allies within the administration, people who would be willing to work with you. Because sometimes working with the system can be so fruitful if you find the right kind of support within the system. So that's something that one should keep in mind.
Thank you, Shantan and Amanjeet, for your brilliant pointers. I think Amanjeet's last point of working with the system, I think I'm really sitting with that idea quite a lot and thinking of ways of how we can continue doing that constantly and try reaching the goal that all of us want to reach. So I'm also thinking of the time, and I'm thinking if we can pause for questions in case there are any. And if there are no questions, I think we'll just take a one small pointer before closing. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to either write it in the chat box.
So while we are waiting for questions, if I may add on to the conversation that was happening. So when we talk about working with the system, I I think Amanjeet is with me on this, that we are also saying that the system is working with us. And I don't know what's happening on my Zoom screen. I didn't do anything. Anyway, what I meant to say was that that in this collective effort with the system and those who are working with it, uh, the system also has to change, right? This is what I've been constantly drawing our attention to when I say that our very imagination of what campuses mean and are supposed to look like has to change somewhere. And the more open we are to the idea that this change has to happen and this change is a necessary part of DEI, is 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 I think yeah, the more open we are to it, the better it is in terms of the initiatives that we are talking about. So when we, for example, when we talk about using proper pronouns in the classroom, um, many instructors, professors, even administrative staffs, and sometimes even students um, talk about how hard it would be for them to unlearn the kind of grammar that they've been taught since school. And fair enough. I mean, we've spent a lot of time learning grammar and recognizing that is different. But one is that gender neutral pronouns are very commonly used in the English language. It's not something that is drastically new. But but more importantly, we are talking about bringing into the conversation communities that have been left out for a very long time, and that inclusion cannot happen with the frameworks that already exist, syntax that already exists. This has to change, and if that means um, people with privileges, people from dominant groups, having to let go of some of those privileges or having to unlearn and relearn the way language works, the way structures and infrastructures and curricula work, and they try to build newer and better ways of doing it. So be it, is my sense. It will take time. It is hard. It's a negotiation, and we just have to be proactive about it. Yeah.
Definitely. It's a lot about conscious change that needs to be made. And I 100% agree that everyone needs to make an effort to
Yeah.
to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think there are any questions. And right before we end, I'm just wondering if there are any.
Shubhika,
Yes,
if
ma'am.
there is time, some 3 minutes, if I can get.
Yes, yes.
Uh,
Absolutely, Dr. Seema.
yeah, this is Dr. Seema from SIM Nasik. Uh, just I'm taking the initiative of DEIB there. I'm researcher also in DEIB. That my domain is gender sensitization, and we are having gender champion over here in the campus, and a lot of initiatives we are having in research also, that we meet people across there in HR, even the students on campuses, HRs there in industry and all. So there happened much work in DEI. Even industries are taking care of this E and I. But my question now, all on this platform actually is that what conscious efforts that all the stakeholders in the procedure should do for implementation of that effective belonging. Because means though we are practicing a lot, researching a lot around this, we don't have concrete metrics to see that B is implemented effectively. Because DEI is there in the policy, people know about this. There are efforts to do that effectively. But somewhere I feel that for effective practices of B, what all the stakeholders can do for this.
Thank you. No, that is an excellent question, because belonging is something that I studied as a part of my project as well. And I think one challenge in terms of thinking about belonging, at least of queer, trans, and intersex students, is what I've been trying to say, that these are campus spaces that are not built for them. These are not built keeping their experiences in mind. So if you visit a city as a tourist, and the city that is not built keeping in mind your experiences, you feel an alien in the city. Now, because you are a tourist there, you spend 7 days, you have fun, and you come back. That's sustainable. But if you're a student on a campus, and even if you're doing a PG diploma program, you're there for at least a year. And in most cases, you're spending 3 to 5 years on a particular campus space. And that is where the challenge comes. Imagining the campus space as a space akin to home. I don't want to talk about campuses as homes, because homes are also very violent spaces for many queer, trans, and intersex people, but something that gives you the feeling of being comfortable in a comfortable space. So what I found while researching belonging, at least in the context of science institutions, is a combination of community and culture. So we realized that many science institutions have cultures that are very masculinist, right? So they all look like boys' clubs, many boys, very few women in most science institutions, especially if these are research institutions. So the entire the way the conversation flows, the way people socialize with each other, everything is structured by a certain kind of masculinity, which is very exclusionary for people who do not identify with that masculine narrative. So one way is to recognize and perhaps facilitate diverse cultures to coexist on campuses. And I'm not talking about cultures in terms of geographical cultures and religious cultures, but I'm talking about cultures as they are structured by gender and sexuality. The second point that we realized is the question of community and community building. So letting queer, trans, intersex people build their own communities and giving this community a certain recognition, right? So if the institution says, okay, we are happy to formalize this group of people, this collective, as a formal club that has some funding and some power and some negotiation power to negotiate with the administration, some sensitizing power to negotiate with the rest of the student body. I think together recognition of diverse communities and diverse cultures goes a long way in people finding a space of belonging within this larger alienating campus space. So my sense is that even if you don't associate yourself with every single brick on campus, every single person on campus, can campus spaces facilitate these small pockets where people find a semblance of a home, is my sense.
Yeah,
If that
great.
answers your question.
Yeah, a semblance of home. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm taking this as a takeaway. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Seema, for that wonderful question and for Senthan for that wonderful answer also. We also have Dr. Girija with us. She's our head for Symbiosis Center for Emotional Wellbeing.
Thanks, Shubhika. And very big thank you to both Amanjit and Shayantan for joining us today for this wonderful discussion. I think we need to have these also on a sustained level. I was listening to the conversation intently throughout the last 1 hour. And definitely, I think at Symbiosis, slowly but surely, we are taking a step towards building DEI. And as you both very rightly said, it begins at an individual level first. I think first we need to believe that this is required and then prioritize it, and at a management level, top-down approach, taking those concrete small steps towards building an inclusive culture. I think, we've moved from exclusion to segregation to integration, and now we're coming to inclusive. So these are concepts that are still evolving, and therefore a lot of shift needs to happen in the mindset. So where SCEW comes in is to build in that self-awareness. I think for every individual to have that capacity to reflect and look at our own biases, our own prejudices, our own stereotypes. I think because we grow up as a child, I remember that, when eunuchs as a community, when we would encounter an eunuch on the street, there was a certain association made with that. And there was a lot of social messages that we heard growing up. And therefore, a certain identity got formed within our mindset. I think as a concept of gender is evolving and we have more understanding of it, I think it's important that we challenge and unlearn many of these concepts. And once there is more clarity in our own understanding, then, we will move towards being a more inclusive culture. But beautiful, I think. Thank you so much for, giving us your valuable time. And we hope that we can carry this conversation forward and you could be guiding us in a more meaningful way through our journey here at Symbiosis in creating similar spaces here within our university as well. And thanks, Shubhika, for facilitating it beautifully.
Thank you, Dr. Girija, for those words. And of course, to Amanjeet and Sayantan for this wonderful conversation and for such enriching discussion, for taking out the time. I was wondering if you had a food for thought for all of us that you want to leave us with, a reflective idea, a word that you want us to take away.
We are so close to lunch. I don't think food for thought is what we need. I think most people need food. No, but Amanjeet, over to you. Yeah.
I think something that I just keep telling everyone is just respecting differences. That's really the starting point of this journey. And of course, like having that curiosity to learn, understand, read. And once you have read, then again, unlearn, read more. That's very, very important because, one really has to keep updating themselves. And just because you may have interacted with 100 students doesn't mean you know exactly how the entire community feels, right? So understanding that experiences are extremely unique, diverse, and it's important to respect differences is something where I would leave this at.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Amanjeet. Sayantan, apart from food, if you want to leave us with something.
I wish I was leaving all of you with food. I'm not leaving all of you with food, but I'm happy to invite all of you to Kriya if and when you get the time, and we should have food then. But in terms of the conversation that we've been having, it would be great to keep in mind that the process of unlearning and relearning is not easy. So this is not to hold you against or hold anybody, including myself, against impossible standards. Nobody here is expecting a change to happen overnight. I wish that were true, but it is not, and we recognize it. But I think the idea of active effort is very important because we've been talking for a very long time. When I was an undergrad student, and this is like many years back, we had started initiating some of these conversations, and now it is many years, and I have become assistant prof, and we are still talking about some of those issues, and the conversation has not moved, and that I find is something that must change. We must show some progress, even if we are not overhauling everything overnight. But the conversation should move forward. There, we must see, okay, the complexity of the discourse has changed. And now we're talking about different issue that we didn't recognize, whatever, 15 years back. So some of these, I'm leaving this conversation with a slight, I mean, this feeling, this nag that why have things not changed? But I'm also leaving this conversation with a lot of hope to be in this community of people who are here, have spent the last 1 hour listening to us and thinking about these topics and are willing to engage actively, put in more active effort. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you each and everyone for joining us today for this webinar, for taking out the time. And of course, a special thank you to both Amanjeet and Santan for taking out your valuable time and being here and enlightening all of us with this wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us and
Thank you. Yeah,
doing
absolutely.
this. And like you said, I think looking forward to more collaborations and sustained efforts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye. Okay, I'm going to drop out of the call.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Santan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shuvika. Thanks.